Hello, everyone. Welcome. For those of you joining us here today in person, and those of you logging in online from wherever you are in the world, it's my great pleasure to, as the director of CIW, my name is Ben Hillman. It's my great pleasure to introduce our first visiting fellow for 2022, our first post-COVID visiting fellow from American University in Washington, Joseph Torigian. Joseph is going to be with us at the ANU for about 6 weeks, and he has a long lineup of fascinating seminars to deliver, beginning today with his book talk, Prestige, Manipulation and Coercion, Elite Power Struggles in the Soviet Union and China After Stalin and Mao. As part of this project, Joseph has dug up a bunch of really interesting archival materials which challenge some of the consensus views on how power changes hands in Leninist regimes. And he's going to be telling us all about that today. For those of you online, you're very welcome to prepare and send questions for the Q&A after the talk, which will be for about 30 to 40 minutes. And then we'll have plenty of time for question and answers. Please use the chat function if you are watching online, and we will collate your questions and present them to Joseph during the discussion period. Great. So big welcome, Joseph, to Australia and to the ANU.
Thank you so much.
Over to you.
Well, first of all, let me say what a big honor this is. This is my first time in Australia. I was a little bit worried about the jet lag. I've been here since Friday, but the long blacks and flat whites, which I'd never had before, have really made the jet lag not as big of a problem as I had thought. So I feel like I'm basically over it entirely. A huge thank you to ANU. This is the very first time I've given this book talk in person. So it's a real honor to do it here. It finally feels like the book is actually out and physical and real. And so big thank you to all of you for coming and hearing a little bit about it. I also wanted to mention that if people have questions of clarification or particularly strong reactions while I'm giving the talk, to please don't be shy and just throw your hand up in the air and interrupt me so we can have this be as informal of a chat as possible. So the book is about power struggles in the Soviet Union from 1953 to 1957, and China from 1975 to 1981. And the conventional view in the historiography is that these two transition periods had a lot in common. That there was a confrontation over economics and politics, and ultimately there was a triumph of reformers over conservatives or radicals, and that ultimately the victories of Khrushchev and Deng Xiaoping were the result of a victory of inter-party democracy and collective leadership. And this historiography has a lot in common with the political science literature on how Leninist regimes work. And that's no surprise, because a lot of that political science literature drew precisely upon these two cases to theorize. So the conventional view on Leninist systems, I break down into three different parts. The first is that the leader who provides the best patronage model or popular policy platform wins the power struggle. It's essentially a popularity contest, right? That there is a defined group within the elite, usually called the selectorate, who gets to pick the leader. And finally, that the power ministries do not play an independent or unique role. So I group these three ideas into what I call the economic model, because they have a pretty obvious elective affinity, such that ultimately, if you have a good platform or policy, you canvass within a particular group and they select you, and that is how the power struggle ultimately is concluded. But the cases that I look at in my book suggest both that the historiography that I just described, as well as this political science idea about how Leninist regimes work, are sorely lacking. And that ultimately, what we see in the case of Beria, who was removed in 1953, the removal of the so-called anti-party clique in 1957, when a majority of the Presidium rallied to remove Khrushchev from power, the purge of the Gang of Four in 1976, and the slow pushing out of Hua Guofeng, Mao's initial successor from 76 to 81, actually was a politics not of exchange, but of personal prestige, historical antagonisms, backhanded political maneuvering, and a substantial role for the specialists in violence. So in other words, two of the most important successions in 20th century world history were not so much victories of reformers over conservatives or radicals, as previous accounts have argued, but a settling of scores. So to summarize what this new historical evidence suggests is first that not so much whether your policies are popular or you provide patronage as being important, but that personal prestige in terms of what you contributed to the revolution, your seniority within the party, and also the use of compromising material, compromat to use the Russian word, are more important than dispensation of patronage or these real policy differences. So that's why you would select someone or not. The second is that we don't see canvassing for support within a defined group, but what the game is more about is manipulating ambiguous rules. Meaning if you are able to decide that it's the central committee that makes the decision or the Politburo that makes the decision is more important than this idea of trying to get support from some allegedly defined group. And finally, the position of the power ministries, meaning the military and the political police, aren't just people who vote as members of the central committee, but really have an outsized enormous effect on these power struggles. So what I do in the book is, methodologically speaking, I take these two models that I just showed you, these two completely different sort of ways of thinking about how politics works, one of exchange and one of domination. And I thought to myself, what are specific questions that I could ask the evidence that are not banal, but could be answered with this material that has really obvious implications for how we think about these kinds of polities from a theoretical perspective. So with regards to fighting over what, I ask, did the winner have a leadership style that was unambiguously more prone to consensus, collective leadership, and co-optation than that of the losers? Because you would think to yourself, if you're someone who's really good at getting along with other people and listening to what they want, that if it's about popularity, then that would benefit you. But what we see in these power struggles is that the people who are dominant, tough, and to use the word of Mike Oxenberg about Deng Xiaoping, ass kickers, these are the types of people who counterintuitively tend to come out on top in these types of power struggles, right? Second question is I ask, were policy differences real, or were alleged differences manipulated and overblown for the purposes of political struggle? And this is really surprising and not intuitive, I think maybe from a Western perspective, that you would think that policy matters, right? That if people don't like what you're doing or see that you're incapable of executing a meaningful policy agenda, that you would be punished for it. But what we really see is that to the extent that these policy struggles allegedly made a difference, they were either made up whole cloth or oversold to create a weapon with which to hurt the other person, not actually real meaningful policy differences. And finally, I ask, to what extent did the outcome revolve around personal prestige, historical antagonisms, and the threat of compromising material? And what the evidence shows is that this is really what the coin of the realm was all about, right? Debates about what you did before the revolution, what you did during the revolution, and what you did during the Cultural Revolution in the case of China, and the Great Terror in the Soviet Union, and who had the compromising material about who did what during those periods. So that's why you support someone, but what about the mechanism for selection? Well, the first question I ask is, was there serious deliberation about the strengths and weaknesses of a competitor? Or did the winners conduct discussions in an unfair conspiratorial spirit and present the decision as a fait accompli? So what we do not see in these regimes is a conversation at a Politburo meeting or a Central Committee meeting where the two different sides lay each other's positions out and there's a meaningful vote. But really what you see are conversations behind closed doors, which actually allows very small numbers of individuals to create fait accomplis that essentially prevents an ability for a real meaningful discussion, right? And then I ask, were the winners determined by a power struggle within a single defined group, or which group was in power to determine the winners? And what we see in all of the 4 cases that I talk about, that a crucial element of the game was whether it was the Politburo that makes the decision or the Central Committee that makes the decision. Because it's possible that if the decision is made in one of those 2 bodies, you would have an edge, but not the other, right? So we see people fighting for time, trying to delay a decision as quickly as possible so they can rally a different body in which they have a more likely chance to succeed. And finally, to what extent did winners violate even ambiguous rules? And this shows that these are systems that aren't entirely without institutions, and I'll talk about that more in a minute. But what we see very often is that even from the most tendentious interpretation of these rules, the person who is doing more of the violating is actually coming out ahead, essentially, right? So they're not facing meaningful costs by breaking even the most ambiguous rules. And finally, who enforces the rules, right? So if these institutions, these rules are ambiguous, then definitionally speaking, it's the power ministries who get to decide which version of those rules are ultimately going to be enforced. That's why these individuals with the guns are so crucially important in these types of Leninist regimes, despite claims by people like Samuel Huntington about Leninist regimes being so such good cases of civilian control. So I asked, did the leaders consider the power ministries to be irrelevant to struggles within the party, or did they consider control over the coercive organisms to be essential? And second, I asked, when members of the power ministries expressed an opinion on the power struggle, was the effect equivalent to their voting power in the political bodies in which they had a seat, or did their positions threaten the potential use of force and therefore had an outsized effect? So asking these questions is essentially how I weaponize those theories that I started this talk with. But I also want to say that even though everything I've talked about so far is saying that the Leninist literature that political scientists do that emphasizes institutions got a lot wrong, I don't want to say that they're entirely irrelevant, right? So Joseph Fewsmith, he recently wrote a book about how institutions don't matter in China, and when he read my book, he saw what I'm saying as sort of a Goldilocks approach of saying that it's not institutions aren't completely irrelevant, it's just that they matter in specific ways. So how do these institutions work? Well, they're knife fights, right? But they're knife fights with sort of weird rules. People don't just shoot at each other at Politburo meetings, right? So the first is, what's really interesting is that competitors will go to great lengths to present their victories as legitimately as possible, right? And in fact, that's very often why we have such wrong ideas about the power struggles that we talked about, because the winners told their own story to make it seem like it was actually about something than what it really was. Because as you can guess, the power struggles are like the model that I just described as, then it's very sort of distasteful, right? Also, leaders won't use any more force than necessary, right? So, for example, one case I don't talk about in the book, but I have an article at the Journal of Cold War Studies, is the fall of Khrushchev in 1964. And there was a debate among the plotters about whether they would arrest Khrushchev or confront him at a meeting of the Presidium. And they said, well, if we arrest him, then it's really hard for us to give a justification for that. But if we confront him at a Presidium meeting and still make it sort of as much of a fait accompli as possible, then we have an easier story to sort of tell. So they didn't want to go any more than they thought they could get away with, but they didn't feel they needed to be any more violent than necessary. Losers will not defect. So what do I mean by that? Well, keep in mind that the people who join these regimes, people who are members of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union or the Communist Party of China, these parties are the meaning of their lives, right? These are organizations to which they dedicated essentially everything that they had spent their entirety of their efforts doing, essentially, right? So that means when you lose, you don't go create a new party. You don't start a revolution, because that would be an attempt to destroy everything that you had worked so hard to create, right? So Stephen Kotkin, who's written a series of biographies of Stalin, when he read my book, he said that he thought this was the most interesting thing, but also the most telling characteristic of Leninist regimes versus other authoritarian regimes like personalist regimes, where essentially if you lose a power struggle, you don't really believe in the regime in a way that's going to make you just shut up and not and try to resist it. And finally, the power ministries are not an independent force, they are invited in, sort of like vampires, right? They can't just walk into your house, they need to knock on the door and then you say you can come in. So in that sense, it's not like the military opposing the civilian leadership. It's just the idea that who controls the military can really have an outsized influence. But it's not someone who is wearing a military uniform, walking into a Politburo meeting and arresting the Politburo. That's not how these things work. So in these sense, I want to say that institutions do have some significance. So I'm giving another talk, I believe next week, which won't be online, it will just be in person, where I will talk about how to find sources and how to interpret sources. But sort of as a preview, I'll talk a little bit about that now, so at least you have a little bit of a sense of why I'm able to make these claims that are so different from conventional understandings about especially Chinese history. And ultimately, I think, and I'll talk more about this next week, it's really hard to do research on China. It's especially hard to do research on elite politics in China. And it's really, really hard to do that given an environment in which Xi Jinping has explicitly said that competing narratives about Chinese history are a threat to regime stability, right? Even so, I think it's an especially exciting time to do research on elite politics, because there's so much that's now available that we can look at that hasn't been actually used. For example, as you'll see on this particular screen here, there's lots of primary sources, Nebu material, that is more easily accessible outside of China than it is within the PRC. For example, if you look in the upper left corner, this is a series of physical books. They're very expensive and not everybody has a full set of them. But it's probably all the way from that corner of that wall all the way to here of just Nebu books, basically. And a lot of them are literally document collections, and it's sold out of this sort of clearinghouse in LA. And boy, is there some really interesting stuff in there. There's a lot of digital databases, right? So people might have heard of the Seomyung-yi Cultural Revolution database. It's not just actually the Cultural Revolution database. There's lots of really good primary source material in there. University of Freiburg has a Maoist legacy database. It used to be that even if you couldn't go to the central archives in Beijing, you could go to archives in especially Hubei or Shanghai, and you'll see in my book that I use a lot of that stuff, especially for the Hua Guofeng chapter. That's a little bit harder, but normally speaking, when people do get those archives, they'll hand them over, like I do, to places like the Wilson Center, and then they'll get translated, or even if not, you know, it's still sort of a clearinghouse, so you can get primary sources through there. We're all sort of on the same team, I feel, so I tend to be generous of a philosophy when it comes to sharing sources, although other people aren't. But also, I've gotten a lot of stuff just buying it from this website called Kungfuzawang. I don't know if people have seen this particular website, sort of a used bookstore website, but you can buy lots of sort of Nebu material on there. Or if you don't want to do it, then I'm sure you could go to your ANU librarian, who probably is already pretty involved in doing that kind of thing. So you can get primary sources, right? Even without going to China. Actually, I just talked about that. But also, Hong Kong has just been, even through the last few months, they have continued to do this. Published either, as you'll see in the far left corner, extraordinary histories of China by Tijane, like historians with access to primary material and who can do interviews, who publish outside of censorship law, and they're not punished for it, and they are literally people within the system in Hong Kong, and that stuff is really fascinating. But then even people on the so-called left and right, they've historically also published memoirs in Hong Kong, completely outside of censorship. So that's Deng Liqun in the middle, and that book on the far right was written by Hu Yaobang's daughter. And that kind of stuff is amazing too. But even over the last year, there was a major book that was a history of the People's Liberation Army during the Cultural Revolution that was published in Hong Kong. There was another 3-volume set of one of Xi Zhongxun's former assistants. That's the father of Xi Jinping, who was deeply involved in Tibet work. That is really sort of a something else publication. So I don't know how long this is going to last. Louisa Lim is in the room. She can speak more to this than probably anybody on the planet. But so far, probably not going to last or be like it was in the past. But it's persisting at least a little bit. And we'll see how that goes. But in any case, the one that's already been published, they're out there now, right? And I'll go a little bit faster on this because I'll talk more about it next week. For a very long time, party history journals were really publishing amazing stuff, even the ones in Beijing. Stuff on Zhao Ziyang, stuff on Hu Yaobang, stuff on the Great Leap Forward. Don't use CNKI anymore. Try to go to physical copies because that's getting a little bit more problematic, unfortunately. Okay, so let me get into the fun cases. Right, enough of the political science stuff. Enough of the materials. Enough of the methods. Let's talk about the Gang of Four. and then I'll talk about Hua Guofeng. As for the Soviet cases, if people are interested in that, we can talk about that too, but this is the China and the World program, so we'll talk more about China. So the conventional view of the Gang of Four we all know, because this is a China group, that this was a very tightly knit set of individuals that worked in concert with each other, that they were extraordinarily radical, that they had an exclusionary position on the so-called old comrades, and that they were very aggressive. And I want to say that the gang were not pushovers, and there were certainly leftist elements to them. But what's interesting is that they combined aggressive tactics with a desire to coexist with other members of the leadership. Their policy differences with others were not fundamental. Crucially, they definitely did not have their own policy platform. They just essentially did what they thought Mao wanted them to do. Their most serious problems were personal, especially with regards to historical problems. A lack of major accomplishments before 1949, which, as I said, is sort of the coin of the realm in these types of societies of 论资排辈, right? It's for the Chinese speakers in the room. And also their association with the worst excesses of the Cultural Revolution. So there was a lot of compromising material, a lot of grudges against them, a lot of antagonism. The gang were unexpectedly arrested instead of being openly confronted at either a Politburo or CC meeting, precisely because there was a fear that if they weren't arrested, that given the number of supporters of the Gang of Four in the Central Committee, they could turn things around and come out on top, right? So let me talk a little bit about Jung Shing. So Jung Shing is unfortunately a little bit of a punching bag, right? She's kind of turned into a sort of caricature. And unsurprisingly, when you actually look at what the evidence says, she's a more interesting figure than these conventional accounts. So this is from a statement that she made in 1976, which suggests that she was trying to move away from how she was associated, as I said, with the worst excesses of the Cultural Revolution, while also putting out a little bit of an olive branch to the old guard. So this is a very interesting statement that we would not traditionally associate with Jung Shing. Our chairman, Mao, of course, said that 70% of the Cultural Revolution was good and 30% was bad. I said this last time and I won't repeat it. I will think more about the 30%, meaning the bad parts of the Cultural Revolution. You comrades who were attacked, meaning the old revolutionaries, should think more about the 70%, meaning the good parts of the Cultural Revolution. The chairman says that the 30% must also be treated objectively. With regard to the 30%, this is the most interesting part, originally I had thought it was simply not my fault. Knocking down everything, doubting everything, I sent Chairman Mao a report. Those were the ideas of Tao Zhu, the former Central Cultural Revolution Group advisor. So here she's saying essentially that she should not be blamed for the worst excesses of the revolution, but also saying essentially that these are things that are bad, right? Then she continued to say, I simply had nothing to do with all-out civil war. Oops. After the chairman's analysis, I then thought that even though it was not my fault, it had occurred during the Cultural Revolution. I was first vice head of the Central Cultural Revolution Group, so it was necessary to think about the experiences and lessons. Sort of a self-criticism here, right? Not something we tend to associate with Jung Shing. So Zhang Chunxiao, so he was the sort of intellectual of the group, right? One of the pens. So if we're going to talk about what did the Gang of Four represent ideologically, it makes a lot of sense to talk about Zhang Chunxiao in particular. So here's a quote from Zhang Chunxiao. When we are criticizing the mistake of using production to suppress politics, cadres absolutely must not give up, must not because of this give up on production. So a practical side to him, right? But also what's interesting about Zhang is that he was, looking at the experience of Mao's previous secretaries, extraordinarily careful about intuiting what the chairman wanted, bringing it to the chairman, but definitely not pursuing his own idea of what he thought was necessary. He said, I do not say anything the chairman does not tell me to say. If the chairman doesn't tell me to move, I don't move. So this idea that the Gang of Four represented its own platform is weakened by this evidence that shows that they thought the game was just doing what Mao wanted them to do. So what were the weaknesses then of the Gang of Four? Why were they so hated? Well, they lacked prestige within the party. Zhang Chunxiao was seen by some as a traitor. In fact, Kang Sheng, who was seen as this leftist, he went to Zhou Enlai and said Zhang Chunxiao is a traitor, which shows that these factions actually are not actually working as much as they had thought. They were tied to the Cultural Revolution. People saw them as symbols of everything that had happened to them so violently over the years of the Cultural Revolution. Jung Shing, in a conversation with the American scholar Roxanne Witka, said something very interesting, which was that if you want to understand my life, you need to read an essay written by Lu Xun called "Gossip is a Fearful Thing," which was about how actresses in Shanghai in the 1930s were always treated deeply unfairly, precisely because of this use of compromising material and lies and salacious information is being used as a weapon. So this is her saying to this American, read that and you will understand what I am facing, saying that my whole life has been trying to defend myself against this compromising material and these types of claims against me. When Jiang Chunxiao's daughter said to him something along the lines of, what is it that you want to achieve? What is the nature of your power? Do people respect you? His response to her was, what base camp did I establish? Which field army did I command? Showing that he understood that according to the party's own understanding of seniority and power, because he didn't have those kinds of contributions, he understood just how weak he was. So these two gentlemen, that's Hua Guofeng on the left and Ye Jianing on the right. So, we have this idea of the gang of being very deeply unpopular, universally unpopular. But what's interesting is that by the time of the purge of the Gang of Four, half of the Politburo Standing Committee were members of the gang. Half of the PSC were members of the Gang of Four. People who didn't like the gang were a little bit more numerous within the Politburo, but there was a fear among people like Hua Guofeng and Ye Jianing that they did not have a good sense of what would happen with the Central Committee, right? Now, this is where it gets really interesting. So in 1957, which is another case in the book in the Soviet Union, the story of that, as I said earlier, was Khrushchev was a small minority in the Presidium, which is what they called the Politburo at the time, but he rallied for time, reached out to support from the military, and held a full Central Committee plenum where he came out on top. In China, when they were thinking about how to manage the Gang of Four, they explicitly discussed the 1957 outcome as something that absolutely needed to be avoided, which meant that you needed to isolate them, arrest them, keep them separate from their ability to rally other people to their banner, right? So this is not like the Central Committee coming together discussing what to do about the Gang of Four. This is a small group of individuals essentially preventing the gang from doing exactly the canvassing that a lot of political scientists actually think works in these Leninist regimes, right? So now I'll talk about the last case, which is Hua Guofeng. And I know that Fertivus is listening in, so you can just interrupt and shout at me whenever I get anything wrong, because of course he and Warren Hassan are the absolute true masters on this kind of thing. So what is the conventional account of Hua Guofeng? Well, that he was dogmatic, sort of radical ideologue, sort of a Mao Zedong light, so to speak, that he tried to block rehabilitation of the old revolutionaries, that he had his own faction, the so-called two whatevers, that he was deeply unpopular. Of course, the most famous thing maybe that almost everybody who's taken a class on China knows about is the so-called Third Plenum in 1978, where allegedly there was this sort of elite revolt, where at a very weird sort of uniquely democratic moment in Chinese history, Hua's radical agenda was rejected by a majority of the party, right? And that this was sort of a sign of Deng as being this great institutionalizer, right? And so on. So the evidence suggests an almost opposite story of everything that I just told you. It's really kind of an interesting thing. That in fact, Hua was very popular in many corners of the party, didn't have his own faction, wanted to work with old revolutionaries, and deserves credit in really fundamental ways for the beginning of reform. So now all of you are thinking, well, what about the two whatevers? Haven't you read any basic book on Chinese history? You know that Hua Guofeng had two whatevers, and what does that mean? Well, first of all, the process of rehabilitating Deng Xiaoping had already begun before this famously, allegedly leftist conservative formulation appeared. So it wasn't about preventing Deng Xiaoping from coming back from power, which is so very often believed to be the case. And the origin of this formulation wasn't this new programmatic statement that we can't move away from the leftist policy of the Cultural Revolution. It was based on this sense that as we move away from what Mao was doing, we need to rally behind something. There needs to be some stabilizing force. Sort of counterintuitively, that was Mao. So the idea of Mao, the symbolism of Mao, but not actually the policies, the leftist policies of Mao Zedong, right? So we now have the archival material from the 1978 work conference, and Hua said that he did a self-criticism on the two whatevers. He said, I did not consider these two expressions completely enough. Reflecting now, if only I had not raised the two whatevers, things would have been fine, right? Li Xin, a Pen who actually came up with this formulation, during an interview later said, if I hadn't come up with the two whatevers, Deng would have come up with something else to use essentially as a weapon against Hua Guofeng, right? Now what's interesting though about the two whatevers is that lots of people within the elite did think they meant all those things that we conventionally have understood them to be. And we can talk about a little bit about that later, which is that even people within the elite very often get these things wrong. It's not just dumb Westerners who are not know how to read the People's Daily. So I'm working on a biography of Xi Zhongxun, that's Xi Jinping's father. So this is sort of where this book I'm talking about intersects with that book. The famous special economic zones, the SEZs. People might have seen this picture before, right? So that's Xi Zhongxun, Xi Jinping's father in the middle, presenting his idea of the special economic zones to Deng Xiaoping, who's sort of like looking up at him as a student. This was seen in a museum, and people debated what this meant with regards to how Xi Jinping wanted to present history, especially Deng. And of course, this picture is completely misleading. Completely misleading as to what happened, right? So this picture allegedly shows something that happened at the work conference in April of 1979. Deng was not present for most of that conference, right? There are 3 different accounts that I've found about what the nature of the meeting between Deng and Xi were about, and one of them says that Deng and Xi didn't even meet at all during April of 1979. But the most interesting thing is that we have the documents from Guangdong, which is where Xi Jinping was party boss at this time, when he went back after the work conference, and he talked about Hua Guofeng, Hua Guofeng, Hua Guofeng as the person who deserves credit for the special economic zones, not Deng. So Deng had this formulation to blaze the bloody trail, and he came up with the idea of calling them a special economic zone. But he was not the person who was the main supporter of this idea of a special economic zone. And we know in the 1990s that Xi Zhongxun, who had gone to Shenzhen for sort of complicated reasons, thought that Deng very deeply unfairly had arrogated credit for that when actually other people did actually deserve the credit, right? So special economic zones, like the symbol of China reform and opening, right? It's about Hua Guofeng, it's not about Deng Xiaoping, right? Okay, now probably people are saying, well, you've given me an account of the two whatevers. Well, what about this practice as the sole criterion of truth thing? People might have heard this expression, right? This idea that over the course of 1978, the party democratically as a whole rallied and said, in this case of alleged elite revolt, we want to move away from Hua Guofeng's leftist model. Well, when this phrase first appeared, it was not about Hua Guofeng. The people who were writing it weren't thinking about Hua Guofeng. It started as basically an academic theoretical conversation, but for separate reasons having to do with the military. Deng Xiaoping thought that Hua Guofeng was moving into his bailiwick in a way that threatened Deng. Deng decided to take this and sort of supersize it as an issue. And it was primarily about Wang Dongxing, who was in charge of propaganda on the Politburo Standing Committee, not Hua Guofeng. And in fact, there is no evidence whatsoever that suggests that Hua Guofeng tried to squash the debate, tried to end the debate. No evidence of that whatsoever. Partly because he wasn't an ideological person and felt that he didn't really have strong views on this kind of thing. But what's crucial is that we have a document of what Hua Guofeng was saying right on the eve of the work conference before the third plenum in 1978. And he said that it made sense to move away from class struggle as the key link. So he was on board with what that meeting ultimately famously did. And Hu Yaobang, during that meeting, went home and said to one of his children, Hua Guofeng in one swipe of the pickaxe broke a hole in the dike. Just how big the flow of history will make that hole is completely up to the power of the people. Hua Guofeng, not Deng Xiaoping, right? So people might have heard, again, of this August 18, 1980 speech by Deng Xiaoping, where he condemned feudalism, where he said we need to move away from strongman leadership, where we need to create real institutionalization and reform of the party. And this, for decades since, has been seen as this programmatic statement that showed that Deng was an institutionalizer. It's a complete misunderstanding of the context of this statement, right? He was coming up with an expression, a shuofa, basically, to justify the removal of Hua Guofeng. This was not about actually saying that the party needed to move away from this idea that you need a core as the top leader, right? And that's not just my interpretation, which is based on looking at when the speech was made shortly after this speech that Hua Guofeng had given, that some people saw was him trying to rally support in the military, which I think is false. It was sort of, again, supersized or misinterpreted by Deng for his own reasons. Deng Lichun, in that memoir that I showed you a little bit earlier, when he was asked about this speech, he said, no, it's just coming up with a good reason sort of to remove Hua Guofeng. And Zhao Ziyang, when someone went up to him, obviously the other side of the political spectrum in China, said, you know, why didn't institutionalization happen? Look, Deng said this in 1980, and Zhao Ziyang said exactly the same thing, that it was about Hua Guofeng, right? I'm sorry, this is the picture of that speech I just mentioned, excuse me. So what was it about then, if there weren't these real policy differences? Well, one of the ways that this worked was through the use of compromising material. This is the so-called 8-person picture, which allegedly showed that Hua Guofeng was closer to the Gang of Four than Hua pretended to be. And it was used pretty effectively against Hua as a sort of compromising material. But Hua had already decided to purge the Gang of Four when this picture was taken, right? Essentially, this was about seniority within the party, where people like Deng Xiaoping and Chen Yun saw Hua Guofeng as someone who helicoptered to the top, right? Someone who had benefited from the Cultural Revolution, which was, of course, this political disaster that they hated. But also, pushing him out from power, as I've been suggesting, wasn't this sort of democratic process. First of all, there was the use of this compromising material, but also there were these devious moves. For example, in 1979, when Hua was outside of the country, Deng used that chance to completely rearrange the top leadership of the military. And he met with dozens of people and said that we needed to do something about Hua Guofeng. Peng Zhen, another old revolutionary, he went to Hua Guofeng and said, are we going to do something about this? And Hua said no. And also, it was through lying about what Hua Guofeng was all about. So all of these sort of wrong impressions we had about Hua were an artifact of Deng Xiaoping's version of what happened to justify what was primarily about something else. Does that make sense? So what does this mean for how we think about Chinese politics today, which is probably why you're all here, as opposed to just wanting to go down history lane with me. Although bizarrely, I just had a media inquiry with someone this morning about the 7,000 party Cadre conference in 1962. So that's even more obscure history than this, I think. So I guess people really are looking to history to figure out what's going on in China today. But there is lots of hope, I think, within China, outside of China, that there will be another third plenum, by which they mean another elite revolt, where the Central Committee comes together and says, like what allegedly happened in 1978, we're on the wrong path. Things aren't going in the right direction. And either removes Xi Jinping from power or forces Xi Jinping to adopt what they wanted. But I think what this shows is that this isn't really how these types of systems work. And they're not really popularity contests. And that ultimately policy differences don't really determine the outcomes of these elite contestation. So I don't want to say that, so the people often say that Xi Jinping rejected the Deng as an institutionalizer that rejected Deng's legacy as someone who created, real restrictions, real guardrails on the top leader. But as this shows, this isn't how Deng thought about power, right? Deng thought that the system only worked with a core. When Chen Yun, another old revolutionary, complained to Zhao Ziyang about how there were never any meetings, Zhao Ziyang said, "I'm just a secretary, I can't hold meetings, you need to talk to Deng." And then Chen walked away muttering to himself, "Just a big secretary, just a big secretary." Deng said that the party could only have one mother-in-law. Chen Yun, who was allegedly, the biggest competitor to Deng throughout the 1980s, the one who allegedly could, restrain him, always put Deng's power first. So even to the extent that they did have different opinions, which they did, for Chen, the big picture was still making sure that Deng was the one who could make final decisions. In 1989, shortly before the crackdown in Tiananmen Square, Chen Yun gave a speech where he referred to Deng Xiaoping as Tozi, right? Which is like a sort of mafia, sort of triad term almost, of like capo, right? Of course, when that was published openly, they changed that to coercive, to core, right? So this is Chen Yun using language like this, right? So Xi Jinping is inheriting a system that even Deng believes only really worked with a core, right? So in some ways, it's a return to the Deng model, I think. But in other ways, it's not entirely, because Xi Jinping doesn't have the reflective power that Deng did as a member of that revolutionary generation, which, as I talked about so much, is something that's really key. But also, Deng liked to rule from sort of behind the scenes, right? Which created a lot of the pathologies, I think, of the 1980s for reasons that we can talk about, because both Hu Yaobang and Zhao Ziyang thought they had more space than they really did, and ultimately got it in the neck because of that. Not because they were opposing Deng, but because Deng thought that they were going too far and misinterpreted his intentions. So I think Xi Jinping actually in some ways is more of an institutionalizer in the sense that he's both the final decision maker, but is also involved in a lot of day-to-day decisions. And why he did that, I think, partly might have to do with the fact he doesn't have what Deng had in terms of reflexive power, but also avoids some of these pathologies, as I mentioned, of the 1980s, where you had this sort of two different lines. So we can talk about what that means for how he may be thinking about the succession, but I've already gone on, I think, for 40 minutes, so I'll stop there, and I look forward to your questions and comments.